Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Today we're doing the second part of our view of the 10th anniversary of the events of September 11th, 2001, the attacks of 9/11. In our last program, we made the point that no proof has ever been put forward that Osama bin Laden participated in the attacks. And to prove that, we used the official FBI website that said Osama bin Laden is wanted for some things, but there's no mention made of 9/11. We presented evidence that the 3 buildings that fell in New York City on the day of 9/11, we presented evidence that those 3 buildings were brought down by controlled demolitions. We mentioned the fact that there was no evidence that an airplane ever hit the Pentagon. We discussed the war games that were being held on the day of 9/11, and we suggested that those were deliberately done in order to confuse the entire issue and make it possible for the attacks to take place. And I raised the issue of why the firefighters who died on that day were in the 2 World Trade Center buildings that fell in the morning, and suggested that they were in there because they knew that no steel-framed buildings had ever collapsed because of fire, and they expected that they would go in, put the fires out, and get out safely. And even that issue has never been raised by the corporate media. And the 10 years since 9/11 have led to many things, many of them not nice, including several wars led by the United States, which Canada has also joined. Our guest is Beau Filter, author of The Cause of War and Aggression. And Beau, maybe you just want to talk a little bit about what has happened since 9/11.
Well, more of the highlights, of course, we've seen the United States has attacked several countries. These countries were not involved in 9/11. But these lists were actually, these countries have been designated for attack even back in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The neoconservatives in Washington decided this was now their chance to take over the world. And so they started writing up a list of countries that they would attack, and particularly countries that had oil. But they needed a galvanizing event. And we can talk about Philip Zelikow, but first I might just take a quote from in 1994, David Rockefeller said that we can have a new world order, which is basically a dictatorial rule by the United States, but we need a catastrophic event. And you see that the whole idea of that, of course, is to get the public to support attacking these other countries. And on the grounds that now we have a war on terrorism. But you see, if that war on terrorism turns out to be a war of terrorism, we have something entirely different. This is why the 9/11 truth movement is so dangerous to the powers that be, because the exposure of having Department of Defense explosives taking down the towers really changes the formula of what's going on. And it should outrage people, because when you have something like this happen, you want to believe your government so desperately. But when the events start to turn on you, you're going to get really angry. And anger is very important, but it's also can be very dangerous. On the positive side, it should make you say, I'm angry, I'm going to find out what's really going on here. I'm going to start reading. I'm going to start looking at the other side of this story. But anger can also be dangerous because it can lead you to attack the whistleblowers, attack the scientists that are bringing out incriminating evidence against the Bush administration. So you don't want to shoot the messenger. That's when anger becomes dangerous. The object of bringing out this information is so people can really start to energize themselves. Use your anger in a healthy way and start to make questions yourself. So what have we had since 9/11 then? Well, we've had attacks of several countries. We know that Syria is next. So Libya has been bombed severely now. And in each case, the oil is very much a large segment of it. They immediately go in, they've taken over Libya's oil, They attacked Iraq, as we know, in the last 10 years. They immediately took over all the oil. They attacked Afghanistan. They took over. The idea of Afghanistan is to have control to build the pipelines from the Caspian Sea region. And so this is nothing less than a world war to take over the global oil supplies. And as far back as 1904, a British economist said the grand prize of planet Earth is the Caspian Sea, the Eurasian oil supplies. They've been looking at this oil for a long time. And so it's natural if 70 to 80% of the existing oil reserves, the world's oil reserves, are under Arab land, under extreme Muslim territory. You can see why there would be an orchestrated public relations propaganda program to demonize Muslims and extremists as terrorists that have attacked America. That would be very fundamental to giving your military and your government an excuse to go attack these other countries and confiscate their oil.
And we should mention that the war on terror, which is always talked about by not only the US regime, but the Canadian regime as well, and the corporate military, that war on terror is really a war of terror, because the West, the United States, and now Canada as well, are terrorizing these people. Imagine how you would feel, how we would feel, if our country was being bombed by the most powerful military force ever assembled on this planet Earth, with weapons that are just beyond comprehension. And we are attacking people all over the Middle East now with these weapons, in large part because of 9/11. And to go back to what we talked about in our previous program, the official story of 9/11 simply has so many questions in it, too many for us to really believe that story. And yet, the 10 years that have come since then have been based largely upon the events of 9/11.
We need to look, too, at a lot of, there's been so many events that we can talk about, but just one, the corporate media, the militarized media, they're looking to fortify their reason for attacking these other countries. And a few years ago, Donald Rumsfeld is on a television show with Tim Russert, Meet the Press. And the London Times fabricated a picture of one of these terrorist cells deep in the mountains of Afghanistan. And they fabricated it, and they decided, well, Tim Russert decided, well, let's just kind of go along with this and see what Donald Rumsfeld has to say. So here I have a picture of what they fabricated. This is a fabrication, and they call it Bin Laden's Mountain Fortress. And you might want to take a look at that.
This was just made by the Times of London, just as an example of
what a terrorist cell might look like.
They didn't pretend that it was real or anything.
No, but Tim Russert, but what he does, he kind of plays along with this. I guess it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. And so he's kind of musing about it, and he says, well, these fortresses are, quote, so deeply down and embedded in the mountain and the rock, it's hard to detect. And Rumsfeld, you would think that he would give a measured statement and say, well, of course this isn't real, but we're absolutely sure that they have them. But he didn't present any evidence, but he could say, well, we're pending to have evidence. There'll be evidence coming up in the near future or something like that. But there was no measured response. Instead, it's almost like he falls for it, and he says, oh, you bet. This is serious business, and there's not one of those. There are many of those. And I might add, Afghanistan is not the only country that has gone underground. Any number of countries have gone underground, unquote. In other words, he's trying to lay the groundwork for the U.S. to have basically a carte blanche to go to any country where they suspect there might be one of these phony mountain fortresses. In the end, what have we found in the last 10 years? Nothing like this. There were no supercells, scientific factories in the mountains of Afghanistan. In Bora Bora, they found a few shallow dugout holes in the walls where dirt dugouts where there were some arms stashed, for all the proxy wars and Civil War things that are going on over there, but nothing to represent something like this. So the credibility of the Bush administration is totally upside down over the last 10 years. And so this is why now citizens around the world have a right to decry. We want a real, original investigation.
Now, I'm just going to interrupt here. We've just had the 10th anniversary of 9/11. It was all over the media for a week. There were political events, memorials, huge amounts of coverage in the media, and yet I don't think any questions were ever asked about the kinds of things we're talking about today. And it's up to us as citizens to stop. Well, I shouldn't say stop believing the official story. I mean, I don't believe it. You're certainly free to believe it if you want to. But at least we need an honest investigation, if such a thing is possible, given the situation we're in Canada and the United States these days. But surely we need an independent, honest, and democratic investigation of what went on so that we know what happened on that day, because we've certainly come down a dangerous road because of it.
Well, you see, the fact that we've had this 10th anniversary, and it's exactly the same very narrow view of what's happened, and all of this evidence has been censored from the corporate media, the militarized media. So that constitutes by itself censorship and obstruction of justice, because the information isn't getting out to the democratic public that needs this information to weigh. Instead, the focus remains very steadfast on the global terrorists involved with Osama bin Laden. But the other thing that was not covered also is the fact that the bin Laden family has been in business ventures with the Bush family and administration for decades. They didn't attack all the names of the so-called hijackers. 9 of them, I've even brought a list of these 9 with me, are still alive and well. We know where they're working. And so
you're saying that of the 19 people who are accused of having planned and carried out these attacks, of those 19 people, 9 are still alive?
9 are still alive, and I can give you the names of them. I don't know if you want to go into them, but about half of them are they have respectable jobs. About half of them are Saudi Arabian Airlines pilots. Others are doing other things, but they went to, when they found out that they had been named, some of them went to the embassies, U.S. embassies, what's going on here? And one of them, they intimidated so much, he's too nervous to even talk about it.
Now let me ask you a question. Let's say somebody's my name is Tom Smith, and I'm living somewhere, and suddenly my name goes up as one of the people who made the attack on 9/11. Well, there's lots of Tom Smiths. So how do you, just because these people are still alive and their names are used, maybe there are many, many people with the same name. Is it that specific individual who is being accused?
Well, see, this is why you need a real criminal investigation. Do they even have the right names? For the 4 planes that supposedly crashed then, the claim is that these were on all 4 of those planes. And there has never been an official list from the airliners that these hijackers were on the planes. So everything is extremely suspicious and unfounded on the part of the government. Were these even the same people? We don't know until we really investigate more thoroughly. But it brings up the question that if these people are alive and well, are these planes even planes that actually went in? Or were these part of the planes that we identified earlier of the operations that Cheney was running that included planes that are remote controlled?
That's right. Last week we talked about the war games that were taking place on the day of 9/11. Several war games were taking place on that date, involving simulated attacks on the United States and simulated hijackings, which through the entire, it placed the entire defensive structure and the airline industry in a very strange position on that day, because they began to lose track of what was happening in real time and what was happening in these simulations, which of course occupied the entire airspace of the United States virtually. And essentially, as Bo mentioned in the last program, a number of the fighter jets that should have been protecting New York City and Washington were pulled out of those areas in order to participate in these war games. So if we were doing an investigation, let's say you and I were doing an investigation, what are some of the things we would find, and what are some of the, who are some of the people who could testify? For example, we would find that there was evidence of controlled demolitions of the 3 buildings that fell on the day of 9/11. Maybe you can just touch on that and go into who would testify.
Right. Well, anyone, there would be several aspects that would be thrown open for investigation. And the experts in those fields, the scientists, would be called to testify like they do in a normal crime scene investigation. The fact that we have today such sophisticated scientific research tools. We're even looking at going back and finding out how what dinosaurs ate 200 million years ago. We have the science for that. The DNA of 9/11 and the World Trade Center collapses, the fingerprints or the DNA is the superthermite. So we already have established that. So, to conduct a grand jury to start to bring this together is something that should have happened 10 years ago. So the stalling, the obstruction of justice, we have been looking at a 10-year obstruction of justice exercise on the grandest scale in history. Now, earlier we were talking about the fact that some of the things that were going on was the involvement of why they didn't attack Saudi Arabia is because, again, we're going back to the reason for all this is getting control of the world oil supplies. And the bin Laden family and the royal family of Saudi Arabia, they're already in the oil loop of the Bush oil empire. So they're not going to be attacked, even though all the hijackers' names are from Saudi Arabia. Any logical person would say, oh, Saudi Arabia, we're going to send our bombers to Saudi Arabia. But no. And other clues help us zero in. What would we investigate? Well, we'd want to find out why, or things about James Baker, for example. He's an insider with the Bush family on 9/11 while it was happening. He's in Washington, D.C., and he's meeting with the representatives of the Osama bin Laden family in business deals, possibly oil. We would want to find out more about that. You see, Salem bin Laden, a brother of Osama bin Laden, bought shares in George Bush's oil company in Texas, Arbusto, back in the 1970s. Salem eventually died. He was in a plane crash, and the man who took over, his sister, is married to Osama bin Laden. And so we'd want to investigate.
Say that again.
The wife of Osama bin Laden's, her brother took over the shares of Arbusto Oil Company that George W. Bush owns. The marriage or the connections of the Bush family and the bin Laden family go way back to the beginning of the Taliban and the Mujahideen. This was one of the most expensive covert operations. It was to lull Russia into attacking Afghanistan, and they spent billions of dollars. And Osama bin Laden was what's called a CIA asset. He helped run the operations in that war in Afghanistan. And so...
Who was the head of the CIA then?
I'm not sure. I can't remember. There's sometimes they stay a long time, sometimes not. But several directors, because it lasted quite some time, as you know. But they brag about, Brzezinski, for example, brag about, yeah, we suckered Russia into their own Vietnam. And the whole idea was to try to drain Russia down to its last dollar so that they wouldn't be able to hang on to their economy and their nation state. And it did. Of course, Washington.
So getting back to this investigation, if we were going to investigate the bringing, well, let's look at the Pentagon. If we were going to investigate the supposed plane that hit the Pentagon, would we find evidence of an airplane?
Well, firstly, we'd want to get our hands on all those tapes. And if they refuse to give them to a grand jury or whoever was legitimately investigating, then that would be obstruction of justice.
And when you say the tapes, you mean the films?
The films that showed what actually hit it.
Yeah.
For them to give us 2 tiny little clips in a total of 10 years is equivalent to obstruction of justice. They had them. If they destroyed them, destruction of evidence is a felony. So we'd have to investigate that. The Sheraton Hotel would have to be investigated. What did these people see?
Now, the Sheraton Hotel was near the Pentagon, and there were films from the hotel cameras.
There was a camera on top of that, and the FBI came in and took the camera away from the employees there, who apparently were watching in horror what hit the Pentagon. But then they grabbed the thing and told them, you don't ever talk to anyone about this, and that was the end of that one. So there's so many investigations that would come out of this. It could cost $1 billion to get to the truth, the big picture. But we already know now that in a regular court, what they look for in a jury, a legitimate court, is they look for preponderance of evidence. So there with the Pentagon then, we have to get the evidence of the tapes, and then why there's only just a hole in the wall. Where is the airliner? That's missing evidence, actually. So then we might go and discuss then more about, because there's so many big topics, more about what's happened with the 9/11 truth movement over the last 10 years.
What is the 9/11 truth movement? Because it encompasses scientists, engineers, architects, firemen, surviving family members, yes, of those who died.
It encompasses millions of people who have dared to look at other evidence rather than that very narrow information brought down by the corporate media. And the corporate media today, for the last 10 years, and it's very focused on demonizing anybody. They use it in their films and to demonize anybody who comes out and says anything against the idea that Osama bin Laden. So this, the 10th anniversary is almost like a religious ceremony. We're fighting evil, and anybody who doesn't kowtow to the line is obviously our enemy. Because there's something wrong with them. But the evidence, so what's really happening then in the 10 years is the 9/11 truth movement is growing. It's an inverse relationship. From day one, you and I even believed that foreign terrorists did it. Probably 99% of the world at least believed it the day after 9/11. But as evidence started to come in, the relationship of the number of people that have believed that and now understand that there's other incriminating evidence, it's going straight down. So now these people are really in danger of having a criminal investigation launched against them. So they're holding to the corporate media to make sure that these people people don't look at them. You're not supposed to. You see, if you're a good disciple of this new religion of war on terrorism, you won't look at anybody else. The head priest, George Bush, would say, you're either with us, you're either with our religion, our state religion, or you're with the terrorists. You see, they try to segregate anybody who's discovering the truth about a 9/11 as an enemy of the state. So the truth then becomes the enemy of the Bush administration, and truth becomes the enemy of the state.
And I would say that the Bush administration is really just a small player in all of this. I mean, the power that could make something like this happen is much bigger than the Bush administration. Clearly, the ownership of the American media was totally involved in all of this. CNN, ABC, CBS, Fox, all of them, because They've never asked the questions. All of the things that we've been discussing are never mentioned in the corporate media. And I mean, anybody who wants to even get a glimmer of the truth has got to ask why not, because the problems of the official story are so immense that if the media ever started to ask the questions, within a week, the American people would know.
That's right. Well, the titular control of the media, people need to understand this. 5 corporations, that means 5 CEOs, control the corporate media in America, as well as in Canada. They're just 5 different names. But they all come from the same militaristic background. They all have the same military minds, and so the voice is a single voice.
Yes, the voice
You change the channel, you get the same message. It's just a different newscaster. And this is what people, I hear people complaining about this all the time. Why is the same news on every channel? We have 500 channels and we only get one view of the news. And they always give us, both sides of the story. But it's very, very carefully crafted to always come out with them on top.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been 10 years since the events of 9/11. A horrible disaster. Thousands of people died on that day. Hundreds of thousands and millions have died since then in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan because of the events of that day. Canada and the United States are now discussing a single border around our 2 countries and kind of let's get rid of the border in between us and put one border around both nations. That's being discussed right now. Being kept totally secret by our politicians and our media, but that's what we're up against. Bo, any last words about this whole big issue?
Well, if I wanted to try to encapsulate it in one simple thing to understand in the last 10 years, on day 1, they pinned the tail on the donkey of Osama bin Laden. In 10 years, we can safely unpin that tail and say, at least in respect of the tower, all 3 towers collapsing, it is a job done by the United States government. So we have to pin the tail on that donkey. So if you haven't learned anything, at least focus on the fact, remember that the shift and the onus of responsibility for clearing now is no longer on foreign terrorists, it's on the U.S. government.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching Face to Face.